At 6:59 p.m. local time on October 17, Israel executed a strike targeting the Baptist Ahli Hospital in Gaza City's Al Zaytuna neighborhood. The strike killed and injured hundreds of Palestinians. Al Jazeera, which was broadcasting live approximately 1.2 kilometers west of the hospital, captured the incident in real time.
Those live pictures coming into us from Gaza following reports of an Israeli airstrike, that there have been 500 casualties in that Israeli airstrike.
הפצצה ישראלית בבית חולים, על בית חולים المعمداني ברצועת עזה.
As soon as news of the hospital strike began circulating, cities around the world witnessed an eruption of impassioned protests. For many people, the attack on the medical facility, where thousands were seeking refuge, represented a watershed moment. The strike was followed by urgent calls for an immediate ceasefire. World leaders were quick to condemn the strike against the hospital.
In a statement on social media, Guterres said, "I am horrified by the killing of hundreds of Palestinian civilians in a strike on a hospital in Gaza today, which I strongly condemn." French President Emmanuel Macron said nothing could justify a strike against a hospital or targeting civilians. European Council Chief Charles Michel said an attack against civilian infrastructure was not in line with international law.
As mainstream media outlets reported, the hospital attack featured the telltale signs of an Israeli strike.
It is hard to see what else this could be, really, given the size of the explosion, other than an Israeli airstrike.
A few hours after the strike, the Israeli military used Twitter to deny its involvement, claiming instead that a rocket launched by the Palestinian Islamic Jihad had misfired and struck the hospital. The Israeli military's original tweet included a video clip that purportedly captured the moment of the hospital strike. It quickly became apparent that the video footage did not capture the hospital strike, but instead a different incident that occurred 1 hour later. The Israeli military removed the video about 30 minutes after posting it. Immediately after the Israeli military's initial denial of responsibility, major media outlets began altering their headlines to eliminate any reference to Israel's involvement in the strike.
At 10, the worst single mass killing of Palestinians in the Israel-Gaza war so far. Hundreds are dead after a blast at a hospital.
Later on the night of the hospital strike, the military correspondent for the Times of Israel released a video capturing a barrage of rockets fired from Gaza, followed by an explosion in Gaza. The correspondent surmised that a misfired rocket had caused the explosion, but the video does not, in fact, depict a misfired rocket at all, and has no apparent connection to the hospital strike. Also that night, the geolocating platform GeoConfirmed published an investigation of the hospital strike. GeoConfirmed concluded that Al Jazeera's live footage of the incident shows a Gaza rocket failing and breaking up in two pieces, one falling on the hospital. Meanwhile, the Israeli government's public relations machine was in full swing, with a spokesperson for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu telling CNN that the IDF does not target hospitals, despite significant historical evidence to the contrary. In the early hours of October 18, the Israeli military tweeted footage from Al Jazeera's live broadcast claiming that a missile that exploded in the air 7 seconds before the hospital strike was a rocket aimed at Israel. The tweet insinuated that this alleged rocket misfired and struck the hospital. A few hours later, the Israeli military posted an edited video claiming that there were no visible signs of craters or significant damage to buildings that would be consistent with an Israeli strike. Shortly before US President Joe Biden's arrival in Israel on October 18, the Israeli military held a press conference during which it repeated its assertion that a misfired Palestinian rocket had caused the explosion at the Gaza hospital. During the press conference, the chief military spokesperson presented what he claimed was an intercepted phone conversation between two Hamas members, revealing that a Palestinian rocket had struck the hospital. The military spokesperson also showed what he claimed was a trajectory analysis of a barrage of rockets around the time of the attack. Finally, he cited the absence of structural damage and craters consistent with an Israeli strike. Meanwhile, in interviews with the BBC and CNN, the Israeli military doubled down on its claim about the missile that exploded in the air seconds before the hospital strike, insisting that this missile was a Palestinian rocket that misfired and then struck the hospital.
From me, all you need to do is switch over to Al Jazeera, who broadcasted it live, and you can actually see. I got a screen caption just for you to see. This is Al Jazeera from last night.
An hour after landing in Israel, US President Joe Biden appeared to have blindly accepted Israel's narrative about the hospital strike.
Based on what I've seen, it appears as though it was done by the other team, not you.
That afternoon, the Anglican Church Archbishop who oversees Ahli Hospital held a press conference where he briefed the media about the days leading up to the strike.
What happened on the facts on the ground? 3 days before the actual bombing, the hospital was hit in the 2 floors that I mentioned, and then we continued to receive the notices to evacuate, and then the hospital was struck last night. So these are the facts on the ground that actually happened.
Given that the facts as you have set them out to us here in this room, the Israeli denies that they are involved in the bombing and that it was an Israeli missile, we must accept that they are worthless, they are baseless.
Also that day, a digital investigation by Al Jazeera concluded that there was no basis for Israel's claim that a misfired rocket had caused the hospital strike. According to Al Jazeera, the missile that exploded in the air seconds before the hospital strike was in fact completely destroyed in the sky and had no connection to the subsequent strike. The investigation also found that Israel had struck areas near the hospital 4 times in the 5 minutes before the hospital strike.
The team was able to identify 4 Israeli airstrikes on Gaza, targeting the area near the hospital, starting at 18:54:28, then 18:55:03, then 18:57:42, and then 18:58:04.
British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak urged against rushing to judgment and stated that UK intelligence agencies were investigating the incident. A few days later, Sunak appeared to have reached a conclusion.
On the basis of the deep knowledge and analysis of our intelligence and weapons experts, the British government judges that the explosion was likely caused by a missile, or part of one, that was launched from within Gaza towards Israel.
The next day, the US State Department dismissed calls for an international investigation into the hospital strike.
Would the United States support an international investigation?
I do not believe that is appropriate at this time. The Israeli government has released a great deal of evidence to support their contention.
First, a New York Times investigation published on October 24 found that the munition identified by Israel as a misfired Gaza rocket was in fact an Israeli Iron Dome interceptor missile that had no connection to the hospital strike. This was too little, too late. Second, the recording of an alleged phone conversation between Hamas members was immediately ridiculed by people familiar with the local accent. In addition, the launch site mentioned in the recording was different from the one in the Israeli military's trajectory analysis. On October 18, the UK's Channel 4 challenged the authenticity of the recording.
2 independent Arab journalists told us the same thing because of the language, accent, dialect, syntax and tone, none of which is, they say, credible.
A sonic investigation by the organization Earshot concluded that the 2 voices in the audio file had been recorded separately and then edited together, disqualifying the recording as a source of credible evidence. Crucially, major media outlets failed to include key facts and highly relevant context in their coverage of the hospital strike. Ahli Hospital was initially struck by Israel 3 days prior to the October 17 bombing. After that initial strike, the hospital received warnings from the Israeli military of further strikes. In the 5 minutes leading up to the October 17 strike, Israel struck 4 areas in the vicinity of the hospital. Israel has a long history of targeting hospitals in Gaza. These key facts rarely, if ever, made it into mainstream media coverage of the hospital strike. Finally, rather than fact-checking Israel's easily disprovable claims, Major media outlets instead focused on details that are much harder to ascertain. For example, Israel's claims about the absence of structural damage and craters that would be consistent with an Israeli strike. Proving or disproving these claims would require thorough, resource-intensive investigations that Israel has the power to block. Indeed, drawing as much attention as possible to disputable claims rather than easily ascertainable facts is a time-tested deflection tactic of the Israeli military. Although all the videos used by the New York Times in its October 24 investigation were available within 4 hours of the hospital strike, it inexplicably took the New York Times 8 days to reach its conclusion that an Israeli Iron Dome missile rather than a Gaza rocket had exploded in the sky seconds before the hospital strike. When asked about the New York Times finding, a spokesperson for the U.S. Office of the Director of National Intelligence said the Times and U.S. intelligence agencies had different interpretations of the video, confirming that the U.S. was basing its assessments on the same publicly available evidence as everyone else. While it took the Times over a week to correctly identify the munition that Israel had falsely claimed to be a Gaza rocket, some local journalists identified the munition as an Israeli Iron Dome missile almost immediately. These journalists also pointed out Israel's contradictory claims about the launch site of the alleged misfired rocket. In fact, within 48 hours of the hospital strike, 4 different investigations reached the same conclusion: that the explosion in the sky had nothing to do with the strike against the hospital. In other words, within hours of the strike, the New York Times and other major media outlets had all the information they needed to debunk Israel's claims, but chose not to do so until over a week had passed. The geolocating platform GeoConfirmed, which published its incorrect findings on Twitter 4 hours after the strike, did not delete its tweet for another 4 days, after the tweet had garnered 20 million views. The BBC too took over a week to amend its previous coverage, stating that there is not enough visual evidence to connect the aerial explosion to the hospital blast. The BBC failed, moreover, to explain the significance of this finding. Finally, it took the Washington Post 9 days to identify the munition in question as a likely Israeli Iron Dome interceptor missile.